Hey everyone, welcome to the 363rd episode of the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and your co-host,
Kevin Toffel.
And we have an amazing show for you today. We're going to be talking about the potential end of, well, it's actually not daylight savings time, it's standard time, and what that might mean for the IoT. We've got a story about COVID shutting down Chinese factories and what that might mean for the IoT. We've got an update on ARM, which has laid off 15% of its workforce. Google Home has a new design, and we think it might indicate something about matter. We've got research from a lab talking about how RF sensing can defeat privacy practices. We've got funding for a startup that is building resiliency into the grid. And we've got 2 new items coming for 2 new forms of wireless connectivity, Wi-Fi Halo and the Z-Wave Long Range certification. And we've got 2 devices that are exciting. Yes. Plus, we've got our guest who is Beau Laguerre, who is Director of Imagery and Remote Sensing for ESRI. We're going to be talking about mapping and how you can use mapping and satellite data as a sensor for the IoT. So, all of this and more await you. But first, a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Rack Wireless. Efficient and easy IoT. That's what WizBlock is. With its open source software and hardware components, you can build your IoT solutions on a modular platform as easily as clicking blocks together. Forget designing for just prototyping. Solutions using WizBlock are ready for production. They're compact, easy to install, lightweight, and adaptable for any industry. Visit rackwireless.com to check out their products. Okay, let's talk about time. Not an existential version of time, just the fact that we had to roll back our clocks, and everybody got really incensed about it, as they always do. And suddenly, members of Congress were like, you know what? Let's make daylight savings time permanent.
I am surprised that they unanimously passed that here in the U.S. in the Senate. Obviously, it has to go before the House, and then the president would have to sign it. I'm really surprised because you live in a northern state. I live in a relatively northern state. And if we go to daylight savings time, then we're going to have like kids waiting for the bus in the dark for many, many months.
Yeah, so we're current for everyone who's like, oh, this is confusing. Daylight savings time, aka summertime, which is what they call it in the EU or the British. I think they call it in the EU that too. Anyway, this is what we're in right now, what we just sprang forward to. And while it's nice and people love having that extra hour of daylight in the evening, it does mean that in the wintertime, if we move to that, for example, in Seattle, where I live, they're at the darkest time of year in mid-December. The sun rises around 8 o'clock and it sets at like 4:20. It is very dark.
Yeah.
All the time. And having the sun rise at 9 in the morning and going to 5:20, honestly, waking up and spending like 3 hours in the dark feels really not great. But we'll see. If it passes the House, and if Biden signs it into law, states actually have to pass laws that say, yes, we're doing this. So we could end up with a lot of Arizonas. Arizona is interesting because they actually stay on standard time all year round. So they picked one time and they picked standard time because to stay on daylight savings time, you actually had to have a congressional action. So yeah. Oh, but why are we talking about this? Because it's happening and people are talking about it. But also people are worried about their IoT devices because they're like, this could be bad. This could be like Y2K for all of your devices. And we're here to assure you that that is not true.
I think in most cases, first of all, just to assuming everything goes forward and this gets passed into law, it will not happen in the United States until November 2023. Either trains or airlines or whatever that already made schedules and they need the time to, transition. So it won't happen this year, but this would be the last year that we fall back on the clock in the fall. From an IoT standpoint, I mean, just from a developer point of view, it really shouldn't impact technically any devices if, I would say, two things are happening at the app and server levels. And that is, everything is coded to use a standard, currently used and accurate time zone server, and proper date formats in the code are all standardized as well. My guess is in 99% of the IoT devices, apps and services and software we use, that is already handled properly. So I don't think this is going to be a big deal at all.
Yeah, for most of us with our IoT devices, they're actually the easiest thing in the world to deal with from a time change perspective because they are connected to the internet. So most of my devices just roll right over seamlessly. I remember the first year I had the Philips Hue lights, there was a little bit of a snag, but it was fixed very quickly.
And I've had a device, I don't remember what bulbs it was, but I remember it was bulbs that did not adjust. And there was an update made into that vendor's app. Once it happens once and they get burned by it, they fix it and it's fixed forever in theory. So I think by now it shouldn't really be an issue for, again, 99 or more % of your devices.
Yeah. So if this does pass, someone on your development team should probably be like, you should probably task that person with being like, make sure we follow the right time zones for different areas now that they change this. And that's it.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk about COVID because, y'all, it is still out there. And
depending on who you ask, I agree with you. It's still out there and everybody's getting rid of mandates and so on. And I don't want to get into the politics of that, but it's coming back with a vengeance in Asia.
Yeah. So in Shenzhen and other parts of Asia, there are new waves of virus. Their case counts have jumped threefold. And so they've locked down parts of Shenzhen. They've closed down certain factories, Huawei, Foxconn. And this is going to have an effect, again, on supply chains. So we might see with Foxconn, for example, they're a big supplier of Apple. We might see slower production on some Apple things or it'll just add more snags to the supply chain. We're just noting this because I don't know, we haven't really seen a lot of people talk about this yet, and I can't figure out why, because we're all up on supply chain issues. So I just wanted to mention that and make sure we all are aware that this is an issue that is not going to be solved anytime soon.
I think maybe it's not being discussed because people think, oh, it's just, Foxconn shut down for 2 days. I think they're back at this point. 2 days isn't going to do anything to the supply chain. Oh, yes, it will. You don't just flip a switch and have your factory back up and running 100% capacity, by coming in the next day once you reopen. It's not like a library where you flip on the lights and turn on the computers and you can start checking out books. It's not that way. This is probably going to add a couple weeks to the existing problem.
Yeah. This is why patching is actually such a big issue in industrial settings because, again, factories don't just, it's not flipping a switch. It's a process. They actually practice those processes. I was so fascinated to learn about this. Anyway, let's talk about layoffs. I'm sorry, y'all. ARM has cut up to 1,000 jobs after its deal with NVIDIA fell through. That's about 15% of its workforce. And ARM employs more than 6,500 people worldwide. This is a chunk. What they're doing is they're getting ready to go public because that's the next step after deciding that, the $40 billion NVIDIA deal won't happen. I mean, it's bad news.
Yeah. I mean, they're restructuring to lower their costs. I had read somewhere, and we're looking at a Guardian article right now that talks about the details and, most of the redundancies that are going to be gotten rid of through this. I had read somewhere else that it was not going to be engineers.
Oh, well, that would make sense. I mean, they have so ARM has built a lot into software, their embed efforts. So that might be part of it. Although when you're selling an instruction set, having that compatible software and those kind of, ancillary efforts is really important. It's also kind of a shame because the engineers will be in such high demand. Everybody's building their own chips nowadays, and that's a pretty...
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, if you're an ARM engineer and you're part of this, I can't imagine you have an issue getting a job. But I don't know the administrative areas of ARM, like they have way too much in terms of administrative employees and such. I don't know.
They do have a lot of software in efforts to like tie into things like, I mean, it's a big effort to build a server chip using ARM. So they've got a lot of people around that to do the marketing and evangelism. And they also have people who are, again, building software, building the infrastructure to make all these programs run on that instruction set. So we might see trimming there. And you might see it picked up by companies who are actually using the ARM instruction set to build these chips. So maybe this is not great news. I'm so sorry, ARM. Let's talk about Google Home's new redesign and what it might mean for Matter.
So this is interesting. It's not available yet. However, I did get a Google Home app update on my iPhone just this morning, in fact. And in the notes, it said that, an updated home view is coming. So I guess they're prepping for it now. But the 9 to 5 Google folks got a side-loaded version of the Google Home app working to show what it's going to look like. And I'll be darned, it looks a lot like my controls in HomeKit, such as instead of just flipping lights on and off with a button or moving a dial to do the light brightness, for example, it's more of a slider switch to a certain light level, which is exactly what HomeKit uses. I'm wondering, and maybe it's a stretch, but I'm wondering if the upcoming Matter adoption by Google and Apple, Amazon, Samsung, etc., is going to bring a little more cohesiveness in our controls in our apps. Because that's what this looks like to me. It could just be coincidence.
What it also looks like is if you have a Pixel phone, before Android 12, you were actually able to hit a button and control your apps from the lock screen, basically. This actually it does look like HomeKit, but it also looks exactly like what, if you've been using a Pixel phone, you've been using from the lock screen. In Android 12, they changed it, but you can still, it's kind of quick access to these devices. I think they're just kind of cleaning it up. So yeah, because the Google Home interface has always been super wonky. I think it's ugly.
I would agree with you, except I use an iPhone and you do not. And I know that nobody else can see this right now, but I'm showing you my lock screen control center in Apple, and HomeKit puts all those controls right there too. It always has.
Yes. No, I think it is going that direction. I'm not arguing with you there. For anybody who's been using Google Home from the lock screen, this is what it'll look like in Google Home.
Gotcha. I wanted to argue with you.
I'm sorry. Oh, well. We can argue about something else.
That's okay. Okay.
And that would be great if this is I actually like that interface a lot. I just feel silly pressing a light bulb to turn on a light bulb, I know.
It feels old school. Yeah, we've gotten away from the skeuomorphic stuff, and we just want access to our things in a modern looking way and an easy way. And quite honestly, and again, I don't know how it works on the Pixel, but from my control center pull down on the iPhone, I can take any of those icons or tiles, whatever you want to call them. They're all labeled and they have a little icon to show what type of device they are. If I can just tap it to turn something on or off, but I can press and hold, and then the slider comes up just like it would in the HomeKit app.
Yes. So, hey, if this is the future of Matter and everything gets to look the same, that'd be great. Because then I can switch phones without having to change my physical way I do things.
Oh, but would you?
No, I would never switch phones. Actually, I did switch from the Pixel to a Samsung Fold phone, the Fold something.
Fold 3.
The Fold 3. And I miss Pixel, but I'm dealing with it. One of us has got to stay on Android. Come on, man. All right. Let's talk about privacy. The Smart Sensing for Humans, aka the SMASH lab at Carnegie Mellon, they've done some research that proves exactly what I've been telling people for a long time.
Yeah, this is really cool because they're using sensors to train other sensors. So they call the work IMU2 Doppler, and they're collecting initial data from what they're saying are inertial measurement unit sensors in smartwatches. And I think of accelerometers, gyroscopes, etc., those kind of things that measure movement and so on. They take the data and use it to train a millimeter wave Doppler radar sensor. And they can then detect or recognize actual human movements and behaviors.
And these sorts of millimeter wave and Doppler type sensors, if you pop them in a smart home, they can actually start tracking the movement of a person and saying, hey, this person's brushing their teeth. This person's drinking coffee. This person is picking their nose, slapping their child, all kinds of things. And if you're like, wait, these sensors aren't in my house, you're wrong. Very soon, we will have many more radar-style sensors in our homes. We're actually using them for fall detection. There are companies already putting those out on the market. We will be seeing them actually, well, UWB, those are a little shorter distance, so that's less of an issue. But they're definitely coming. And I'm really excited about them. But I have long told people that while this feels privacy protective to have these RF sensors in the house because they're less intrusive than cameras because they won't take like a picture of you as you're walking out of the shower naked, but they can see that you're walking out of a thing and they can figure out like the motions that include towel drying, for example.
Or if I walk differently than my wife, which I certainly do, they could say, well, that must be Kevin based on his gait.
Yeah. And if you again, kick a puppy, that could be recognized.
Don't do that. Don't kick puppies. Just so to clarify one thing, I totally agree. We're going to see more of these Doppler type sensors in devices in the home, but this aspect of it, by themselves, they're not going to do anything. This aspect of it trains those sensors to actually make the recognition. And they said that they used a neural network based on existing IMU and video data to train a Doppler sensor model for just a few seconds. And it was already 75% accurate in detecting movements and behaviors.
Because a lot of times you're like, hey, it's going to take a lot of effort. Like to figure out if someone's picking their nose is probably, you're not going to spend like hours and a lot of CPU cycles on that.
When you know, you know.
But if it's like super easy to do it, you might be like, well, yeah, let's see. All right. Cool research. Also very cool. I was not aware of the Smash Lab, and now I'm like, I got to get on their news list.
Hulk smash.
Let's talk about energy resiliency because we love it. We've talked about it a lot, talking about making our electrical grid more intelligent, making it more like the internet. So it's responsive, it's two-way communication, and you can get real-time information from it and then take action. There's going to be a lot that needs to happen to actually make this happen, but we are in the process, even though it's like a 20-year process. And Copper Labs is a startup that works with utilities and helps them understand performance and activities happening on their network at different points in the network. So it gives you like they pull all this data together to give utilities a view of like live load availability and demand. So I'm talking about them because I think that's an important aspect in where we're trying to go with the modern grid. And because they raised $5.5 million in Series A funding. So good for them. Next up, we have news on the wireless standards front. Two pieces of news. The first is the first Wi-Fi Halo development board has launched. This is a $99 development board that will let you play with Wi-Fi Halo. And if you're like, what? Wi-Fi Halo? Stacey, I don't remember that at all. Let me tell you. It is Wi-Fi's answer to low-power, long-range IoT networks. So it's 802.11 AH. We've written about it. And the idea is that this is going to make it so you could have Wi-Fi powered sensors, for example, that won't suck up as much battery power and that they can be a little bit further from your Wi-Fi router. Do we need this?
That's what I was going to ask.
I feel like no,
because
but, I also feel like you never bet against Wi-Fi.
No, I agree with that statement. But what I'm looking at here, 802.11 AH, and you get longer range, as you said, and still low power. The big thing this adds is a 15 megabit per second data rate. And I'm like, what sensors need that?
Well, it's also, the idea is like if you had a faraway sensor, it could actually like take a picture and send the image file over a longer range. It can't do, I mean, I guess it could do really terrible video, and that's going to affect your battery.
I would think you could do video. I mean, you're right. Any type of imagery would make sense for this, but I'm trying to think of what else. And I'm coming up dry.
Well, you could have sensors that do, I mean, you could have a big sensor array that does lots. I don't know, in like an industrial setting. I mean, 50, I mean, I'm not going to bet against people wanting to send more data.
No, I wouldn't either, but I don't know. I mean, maybe if you have like a security system and you live at a really large property and you want to, a video.
Think about industrial.
You think industrial?
Yeah, in industrial settings. So let's say you have an IoT gateway that's pulling sensor data from multiple places. Like you've got, maybe one machine with a gateway box on it. So that one machine might be pulling sensor data from like 20 to even 100 sensors, depending on the type of machine.
And that data adds up when you're sending it. Okay. Maybe?
Yeah. I'm going to link to this story in the show notes in case you want to buy this development board, but also because it has a really good chart that compares LoRa, NB-IoT, Sigfox, Zigbee, Bluetooth, variations on Wi-Fi all together. And it's a nice chart. So you should check it out if you're into wireless connectivity. Okay, next up, the Z-Wave Alliance, not to be outdone with a long-distance low data rate option, has announced their first Z-Wave long-range certified device. We talked about Z-Wave long-range a while back. To me, this looks like the savior for Z-Wave because we're all like, oh, if Matter is going to use Wi-Fi and Thread, and a lot of the Zigbee devices, that uses the same underlying radio protocol as Thread, so maybe you can convert some of those. But what happens to Z-Wave? And Z-Wave is like, of course, they want to be relevant. So they put out this standard for long-range connectivity. With Z-Wave long-range, the biggest change is going to be how far you can go away from your original repeater or hub. And Z-Wave long-range has a distance of up to several miles at its highest power output. It's Silicon Labs, they have a chip already out. Their distance that they're saying is 1 mile with direct line of sight at an actually not very high power consumption. So getting a low power 1 mile range is pretty good. You also can support up to 4,000 nodes with Z-Wave long range, which is really great. That is way better than like something like Bluetooth. I could say it's better than LoRaWAN, but really it depends on how you implement your LoRaWAN, and we're not a radio show, so I'm not going to go there. But this product, I'm like, that's all about Z-Wave long range. We've been waiting for an actual product, and Kevin, why don't you tell us about it?
Yeah, there's actually not too much known about it, so I'll tell you the little bit that we do know from the Z-Wave Alliance. It is the EcoLink 700 series garage door controller. So I don't know a price or anything like that. Yeah, I mean, if you have a Z-Wave setup and you have a garage door that you want to automate and Z-Wave wasn't an option because you couldn't reach with your Z-Wave signal out there, now you can. Maybe there's industrial type settings for companies or storage facilities that have garage door locks, whatever. It's nice to see. It took a long time to get this first certification because it's probably been a good year since we talked about long range.
September 2020 is when they announced that they were the spec was out there. But, we're in a pandemic. There are chip shortages. I'll give it to them.
Anyway, if you need a garage door controller and you need Z-Wave long range at some point very soon, I presume you'll be able to purchase this. Again, it's EcoLink is the company.
Yay! All right, now let's talk about, good Lord, blinds. We just cannot stop talking
More
about blinds this year. So IKEA has some new smart blinds. Dave Zatz. Kevin, your buddy Dave Zatz.
Yeah, Dave caught wind of this before IKEA actually announced this. But if you search around on the web, you can find in the EU, there are already product pages for the, I'm going to hose these names, Praktelsing and Tredansen blinds.
Tredansen and Praktelsing.
Tredans. Yes, okay. And of course, these work with IKEA's Tradfi gateway.
Tradfi.
So Yes. So these will work with all the three major ecosystems, HomeKit and Amazon and Google. So this is all good because what these are new versions of the blinds. Like they probably use the same cassette roller mechanisms for the smarts and moving the blinds up and down wirelessly. But
they're honeycomb shades.
Well, there's honeycomb shades and another style. So basically 2 more new styles. That's great. The problem is they're just available in 2 sizes. And I don't understand if IKEA really wants to do this, why they aren't expanding the number of sizes. I don't ever expect them to do custom because that's not the kind of business model IKEA has. It's on the shelf. These are the sizes. Grab what you need and go. But
so Eve launched roller shades that you tried out and liked. And then Lutron recently launched a more expensive honeycomb shade that we were like, ooh, fancy. So basically, the smart shades market is getting there. The next step in this is not just having more options in roller or honeycomb or colors and that sort of thing. The next step for me is integrating it with the lux sensor so they automatically go up and down based on the lighting. Yeah, that's right. That's what I want to see with Matter.
I actually did that with the Eve shades.
Oh, that's right. You did. How'd that work?
I did. Really well. Although, just to give a quick backstory, I used the Logitech Circle View doorbell camera, which has a lux sensor, and I set it at a certain limit. Once it goes, it's daylight, 1,000 lux or 1,200 lux, I don't remember what I chose, bring the shades down. The problem is on a cloudy day, the shades would go up and down and up and down, if it was partly sunny and maybe that's what you want, but maybe it's not.
Yeah, and if you're ever working with a lux sensor, it's important to note that lux is measured logarithmically, so tiny changes in your lux are big changes in light.
Kind of like sound.
Sound. All right, let's talk about a gun safe. Wyze has launched their gun safe. Someone who found
Why are we talking about a gun safe?
I know. Well, so this is actually one of the first use cases I had when I was, tricking out my home in like 2013 or 2012 with like SmartThings sensor kits, was actually creating a notification system for my liquor cabinet being open, right? It wasn't a formal lock, but it was, these are sorts of things and I thought if you had a gun cabinet, you would definitely want to know when it's opened, right?
Absolutely.
Even if it's locked. So I don't think this is a weird use case actually for smarts. So Wyze is offering their gun safe for $154.99. This is the Wyze We're Super Cheap model. It's this is a handgun safe. This is not going to fit your shotgun or anything like that.
12.4 inches by 10.24 inches and only 3.25 inches tall. So you're probably looking at, if you own a handgun, probably I would say any size handgun and maybe some extra accessories, or not many, but that's it.
Yeah, and it's actually just Bluetooth based. So
I have a safe in my house, and it's like I store valuables and like my passport and so on and so forth. And I got it because it was biometric, and this does have biometric fingerprint entry, so that's one of the sensors in there as well. Wyze claims the fingerprint is read in 0.08 seconds. Okay. But yeah, it's Bluetooth based. So Bluetooth to the Wyze app for your notifications. You're not going to, I don't know what I would integrate it with, like maybe red lights are in the house that somebody just opened my safe. I don't know, but.
No, I guess you could integrate it with like notifications that someone opened your safe or maybe your security system. You'd be like, but then I wouldn't want my gun safe to open if like robbers came into my house. Cause what if they got to it first? I don't know. I really.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, you could put your weed in here if you live in a state.
Well, I was just going to say, obviously you don't need to use it for a gun.
But it does feel like overkill for weed because, it's padded and fancy and I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, I can't speak to that. So
if you're in the market for this, it exists.
It exists. And if anybody who needs to know is listening, I don't have any weed in my safe. Okay.
I don't have a safe, nor do I have any weed. But,
oh, okay.
I do live in a state where it's legal, so it is actually a concern here. You could store things of intimate value in this safe if that was also your jam. So, I think, on that note, we should stop talking and move to the Internet of Things podcast hotline. This is the section of the show where we take questions from you, our listeners. And you can reach us at 512-623-7424.
This week, the IoT Podcast Hotline is sponsored by Schlage. Schlage's innovative door hardware is made for modern life. With smart locks that integrate with Apple HomeKit, Amazon Alexa, Ring, and more, it's easy to see why smarter homes start with Schlage. Find the right lock for your smart home at schlage.com.
And as a bonus, this month's IoT Podcast Hotline giveaway item is a Schlage lock. So get excited, y'all, and call us at 512-623-7424 to leave your questions. Now, let's go to our question. This question is from Chris. Let's hear it.
Hi, Stacey and Kevin. This is Keith from Louisville, North Carolina. I have gone completely off of everything but Wi-Fi. So all of my processes, my light switches, my contact switches, I'm trying to get as much away as possible from using anything but Wi-Fi. And the only thing that I have not been able to find Wi-Fi is the switch that you mount on the wall that is battery operated. And I've got all these light bulbs and everything that's Wi-Fi. I'm not using any type of Zigbee or anything like that. So I would like to control these, but I would like to control them with a switch that has no wires whatsoever. It's all just a straight Wi-Fi switch. I realize I can use a button, but I really wanted to stay away from the buttons and wanted to keep with the normal switch. I'm sure it would be thicker because it'd have a battery, but a thicker light switch that does not mount inside the wall, if that makes sense. Thank you so much. We really enjoy your show and looking forward to more podcasts in the future.
So there's a lot to unpack here because we'll get to the products in a minute, but at a high level, deciding to go Wi-Fi only on your smart home, that's not something I've really heard of before, and I don't know that I would recommend it. The main reason is because Wi-Fi is a great solution for a lot of things. It's a terrible solution for other things. So in this particular case, you're looking for battery-powered switches to work with your smart bulbs, and that you have to have them as Wi-Fi. By limiting yourself to Wi-Fi, you've basically said, I'm going to do Wi-Fi switches. Then if you look at Wi-Fi switches, there really aren't any battery-powered Wi-Fi switches. And why is that? A, I'd say there's no market for it because B, Wi-Fi devices are typically not run on battery power. They're typically hardwired or plugged in. So a Wi-Fi switch is going to be hardwired into an existing switch spot. We looked high and low. We did find something from iDevice. It's not quite what you're looking for, but it could work. Stacey, what was that? Like an add-on?
So they have, it's called the Instinct switch. It's like an add-on switch that will control their smart socket. So it controls any iDevice. They built it to be an add-on to it's basically like putting a three-way switch if you need a switch somewhere, but you don't actually have a three-way setup. So if you wanted like two switches on your kitchen, you could wire up one switch with the iDevice and then put this other switch that's battery powered on the wall, like on the opposite side of the kitchen. But for your use case, you wouldn't want to have your smart bulbs. You would want to have their smart socket, which unfortunately is not available. It's out of stock right now. I emailed them, but didn't hear back on whether or not that would be, like when that would be back. And you're going to find this theme of, well, if you don't want to use Wi-Fi, you could use some sort of associated product, which is going to use another network, again, for the battery powered potential.
We don't know what brand of bulbs you're using. And we looked, I want to say, at all of the major ones. And
we looked at Lifex, Sengled,
Sync,
Wiz, Philips Hue.
We checked them all. Like they all make smart bulbs, but they either make a Bluetooth switch or they don't make a switch at all. And third-party switches, again, we came up empty because, again, the batteries are going to run out on a Wi-Fi switch. You're going to be replacing batteries too often, way too often. So you do have a couple of options, and I know none of these are the exact solution you're looking for. You could just buy Wi-Fi actual switches that are hardwired. Replace your existing switches with Wi-Fi switches. you could change over to a different bulb platform, such as Philips Hue or Lutron switches. But again, that's take all of your existing bulbs and you're not gonna be able to use them anymore. And they're not Wi-Fi. So there's no good option because again, what you're looking for isn't an ideal product to begin with.
Right. So we're sorry. What you want is not advisable. That's the answer for you.
Hate to say that, but Wi-Fi is great at so much, but it's not good for battery-powered devices.
And, in a couple of months, we're going to have Matter, and then you might have this kind of converged thread Wi-Fi thing. And then there's things like nanoleaf bulbs, although they don't have a switch at the moment. But you might be able to take a thread light switch to control your existing smart bulbs if they support Matter. Or maybe you won't. We don't know yet. But we're sorry. This is the way.
Before we close this out, though, he mentioned buttons, and that is an option.
True. I use buttons. I love buttons.
But are they Wi-Fi buttons?
No, all of my buttons are Bluetooth or Zigbee buttons.
Yeah. Okay. Forget that, too. I mean, strike 4, because we came out with 3 strikes when we researched this, and we know why. As soon as you asked the question and we heard it, we're like, no, we're not going to happen because of the battery consumption.
You want the impossible. But if anyone else has heard of this or is currently using one and you're like, Stacy and Kevin, you are wrong, give us a shout. All right. Well, remember, if you want us to dash your hopes on the Internet of Things podcast hotline, give us a call at 512-623-7424, or maybe we'll even help you. And that concludes this portion of the show, but please stay tuned for our guest, Beau Laguerre, who is from ESRI. We're going to be talking about mapping and satellites as sensors. But first, a message from our sponsor. This week's sponsor is Save Our Standards. Hey everyone, we are taking a quick break from the Internet of Things podcast for a message from our sponsor. And this week's sponsor is Save Our Standards. Save Our Standards brings together a cross-section of industries to advocate for a fair and transparent standard essential patent licensing system. And I have Alex Moss, who is the executive director of the Public Interest Patent Law Institute. Alex, what is the Public Interest Patent Law Institute, and why are you a member of Save Our Standards?
Well, the Public Interest Patent Law Institute is an organization focused on ensuring that the patent system promotes innovation and access for everybody. We are part of the Save Our Standards Coalition because that is a broad alliance that are all working to make sure we have a fair and transparent system for licensing patents that are essential to standards, particularly the wireless communication standards that are in so many and ever more devices that people rely on.
So how does the public have a vested interest in the patent system?
The patent system is designed to benefit the public. It's designed to make sure that there are incentives for innovation and also incentives for making innovation accessible to the public. Right? Patent owner gets a limited monopoly in exchange for disclosing their invention. And so the sort of twin goals are make sure there is more innovation and more access to innovation. It's critical to the public that both of those goals be being achieved. Because if somebody invents something amazing, but nobody can ever use it, the public gets no benefit.
So tell me a little bit more about the relationship between IoT and standard essential patents in wireless communications.
Gladly. Starting with the standards. Standards are protocols or rules that let devices communicate with each other and with the same infrastructure. So one example is electricity. We have standard outlets, means that you don't have to worry about whether your blender is compatible with the power system. You can rely on that. Even more important are standards for wireless interoperability, because that's what allows different devices to communicate with each other and the same network. Standards for wireless interoperability are highly technical and expansive, and that means there are many patents that claim different aspects of those standards. And if a patent claims part of a standard, it means anybody who's using that standard is using the patent. And that is why access to standard essential patents is so important, because anyone who owns a patent can stop other people from using it, which means that anybody who owns a standard essential patent can stop other people from using the whole standard itself.
And where can people find out more about Save Our Standards?
For details on the coalition, resources about standard essential patent licensing, And to leave your email to get more information, visit the Coalition's website at www.saveourstandards.com.
Welcome back to the Internet of Things podcast. This is your host, Stacey Higginbotham, and today our guest is Beau Laguerre, who is Director of Imagery and Remote Sensing at ESRI. Hello, Beau. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, Stacey.
Excellent. All right. I'm really excited to talk to you because, as everyone who listens to this podcast knows, I get so stoked about infrastructure. And I feel like we take it all for granted, and it's unfortunate. So today we're going to be talking about maps and how we can use them in the IoT and how companies are already using them. And we have Beau here because ESRI is, I'm going to go with the top. It's the company I always think of when I think of GIS software. So Beau, why don't you start by telling us what ESRI does in plain language for people?
Yeah, sure, Stacey. I mean, ESRI is the leader in GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, or plainly spoken, digital geographic mapping and location intelligence. We have software that our customers, our over 350,000 companies, millions of customers, can run either on their desktops, in their large infrastructures on their premises, or in the cloud. That software delivers artificial intelligence and other tools that really provide location intelligence. And this is all used to create maps, dashboards, and other visualizations. So it's the key component of maps.
So to help people understand, because I don't often think about maps and how they get there, but we're talking about things like it's everything from GPS or GLONASS or pick your satellite system to tying your lat long together into coordinates on a screen. So can you break down the process of when I am in a location and I pull up a map, what's all happening behind the scenes?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening behind the scenes. I mean, maps are really just made of layers. And those layers can be, street information, where are the streets, the lines that actually make up the streets, but also the information behind those lines, which we call vectors. Things such as the street name, the address location, the latitude and longitude. That's kind of the basics of a map is that those layers and the attribution of those layers. But those layers can be very broad in nature. They can go into imagery or pictures of that location taken from an aircraft, a satellite, or a ground-based sensor. Because maps all have geographic context and geographic location, we can also build intelligence about locations on the map and build those into the map. And that's what we call location intelligence. And it's just another layer. You talk about IoT. IoT data is often just geolocated points with information, and we can put that on the map as well. So the making of a map really is just the coming together of all of these layers and the layers that make sense to convey the piece of information that you want in that map, whether it's just a regular street map or a map that talks about, okay, this is restaurants, or these are points of interest that I want somebody to know about.
I love it. All right. Now let's bring the IoT into this, because a lot of people may not realize how important mapping is for the Internet of Things. And I have a couple examples, but I would love to hear your examples since you do this for a living and probably talk to way more people than I do.
Yeah, when it comes to IoT, we talk to people primarily who want to put the location of their sensors on a map, but also capture events that occur on those IoT sensors or information about the current state of those IoT sensors and have them inside of a geographic context. We also find people who want to merge the data from that IoT sensor with other sources like satellite imagery or other imagery on the ground, and potentially tip and cue other things. So if an IoT sensor is reporting some type of event or is crossing some type of threshold or is within some type of geographic boundary creating an event, that can cue or tip another piece of information to be brought into a map or a a product that can be created that provides information and extended location intelligence.
Got it. So what I'm hearing from you is easiest thing is probably location of sensors. Two is using satellite imagery as a sensor. And then it sounds like three might be geofencing as a trigger for an event to happen. Does that sound fair?
Yes, that is. I personally am very excited about the integration of the satellite imagery with the IoT, but also the fact that the third thing you mentioned, that we can enforce or expose geofences and create actions based on those geofences.
I am really excited. So we'll talk about that. So I think location of sensors is pretty basic. I know on the imagery, for example, I've talked to folks at Monsanto, well, now they're Bayer, and they're using satellite imagery on maps to understand crop growth patterns. And they're actually using it in place of soil sensors because in a lot of the areas of the world where they're trying to monitor this, the soil sensors get stolen. So they're like, well, never mind that. We'll use satellite data. And I think that's a really interesting use case. And I would love to hear other use cases around using imagery data for IoT or for sensing, rather.
Yeah, let me actually talk about that agriculture use case that you mentioned too, because it's really important. And it's actually something that satellites have been doing for a very long time. And, combined with IoT, it gets just even better. Probably the penultimate constellation of satellites that we work with imagery is the Landsat constellation, which is going to celebrate its 50th anniversary this year, actually, of the launch of the first Landsat sensor. And one of the original use cases for that sensor was the mapping of agricultural fields and the health of those fields. Satellites have been doing this now for almost the entire length of that mission because they can run very simple analytics and determine crop health. And they can do that from space on a very wide basis because satellites take pictures that are very big geographically, and they can capture many fields, and they can provide intelligence to the farmer downstream of how their crop is growing, how the harvest is going, or potentially even expected yield of that field. And an IoT sensor, when they're there and not being stolen, but if they're there, they can just add to that because IoT sensors represent a localization of information, a very small piece of information most of the time. And when combined with the signals that you can get from that large scale sensor up in space, it can provide a very unique and effective and useful combination for the farmer and provide signals of things such as disease and crop health that are, really can impact an operation.
You get the forest and the trees with the sensor plus satellite. When we think of using satellite data as a sensor, what kind of things can they sense?
Satellites can hold a variety of different sensing packages. The most common that a satellite will carry is what's called an electro-optical sensor. I mean, you would think of that as a camera that senses things in the visible ranges of light. Those sensing capabilities are really for pictures. But when you go beyond the visible range of light, you can get into near infrared, shortwave infrared, mid-wave and long-wave infrared, and those sensors can get into sensing gases and thermal emissions and other types of things that you can't really sense with the visible eye, but these types of sensors are tuned directly to sense. So this is where we would sense, emissions coming from things on Earth that can indicate potential greenhouse gas emissions or other types of releases of things like methane and other things that could just happen on the ground.
Nice. And that fits in with my idea that the IoT makes the invisible visible, which is why we love it. We also see satellite imagery used for tracking things like wildfires. Can you talk about how you expect to see this imagery used as we deal with climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Imagery is a key component of climate change and also just climate related disasters that happen. When you talk about wildfire, there is use for imagery in almost every stage of a wildfire event. you can use satellite imagery to look at the potential fire loads and classify the types of materials that could be used as fuels if not either cleared or mitigated in some fashion. And during a fire event, a satellite overpass, especially some of the satellites that we have up in space now that have thermal capabilities that can actually sense, the thermal characteristics of the ground, can be used to identify current boundaries of the fire, which become extremely important downstream information for the maps that are built and provided for first responders. And then post-disaster, imagery can do the work for the first responders, but also for the things that have to happen post-disaster, such as insurance workflows, and further mitigation of the event, and planning for the next event and preventing the next event. So imagery has a wide scope of uses within wildfires. And speaking of climate change, we are really excited here at ESRI about a new data source that we have in the ESRI Living Atlas, which is a content repository available to all our customers. And it is the 2017 to 2021 land use land cover mapping project. And this project produced a land use land cover globally, a map for each year. And those maps were built using a satellite sensor along with some artificial intelligence. And that satellite sensor can create a land use or land cover classification, such as grass, trees, barren earth, water. It can create a class like that for every 10 meters square on Earth. So this is a very vast data set because it's very kind of high resolution, if you will, by the standards of these types of maps. So what this can do is this can show you how land is changing over time. And land use and land cover changes over time can happen for various reasons. It can happen because of human impact, disasters, or climate-related phenomenon. So drought, for example, is one climate-related phenomenon that will change the characteristics of some land, and we can track that. It can go from, say, a grassland to almost a barren dirt classification. And these maps can show that and show it on a scale that could be augmented or complemented by sensors on the ground to either verify that or put further sensing technology that, like an IoT sensor could provide, to say, okay, this is something I have to monitor because this is an alarming phenomenon. So I'm going to put an IoT sensor that could maybe track the moisture content and make sure that it doesn't get too dry here and doesn't provide a fuel load for another wildfire.
Yeah, they're actually using sensors on pilings in northernmost Russia to track they're using satellite imagery to track like the permafrost defrosting. And they look at that to anticipate where they should be allocating their sensors to make sure that their buildings don't fall down as the permafrost melts. That's a very simplistic way of putting it, but it's synergies. All right, so let's move on to this idea of geofencing as a trigger. Just because we here on the show love combining information and creating little programs that help make things happen. So the easiest things, I mean, I use geofencing I have a dog collar that's connected, and if my dog leaves my yard, basically, I've created a geofence around it, and it's like, boom, I get a notification that says, Stacy, your dog is loose. Do you want to start tracking it more closely? Let's talk about ways that can be used in enterprise or other settings.
It's a great example. And, we often think about, if you think about your dog example, if your dog were to break the geofence, in our world, the enterprise would get that notification and it would trigger something like a sensor or a camera to take a picture of the area surrounding your yard. So you could find your dog, if you will, or see if your dog had gone outside of the boundaries still visible. if you take that to enterprise scale, you can track and trigger events that have real impact. I think a lot about corridors, about transportation corridors, utility corridors, and places that have sensors that are almost everywhere along those corridors. And you could use those sensors that if anything triggers within the geofence of that corridor, further action could take place. And in an enterprise context, with using some of the tools that we have at ESRI, we could not only trigger, collection of more data, from a satellite or other sensor, but we could also trigger other events in the workforce, such as actually a workforce order to send a human out there or for a drone to fly. We have those types of enterprise connections that can be triggered based on sensors on the ground that are there all the time and just waiting for thresholds to be exceeded to make or to spur action. But the important thing when you talk about that enterprise context is you have an enterprise where everything is connected and everything can be deployed from.
Now, is this a real life example? Are we that sophisticated yet, or are we still kind of getting there?
So a little bit of both. I mean, when we talk about, triggering like workforce orders to happen based on thresholds, we're there. I mean, we have enterprise integration with workforce applications and workforce management solutions. And now when we get to the point where we're triggering a drone flight, we're actually getting there. We have partners. ESRI has a large partner network, and one of our partners are providers who can take an order for a drone flight and execute that. Now that is the timeliness of that is something that, in the future will get better and better. But all this stuff is going to come together in the future.
It's kind of terrifying to think that if I breach a perimeter, I'm going to have a drone coming right after me. I'm like, especially as a person who gets lost a lot.
Well, but, what if we could have a drone follow your dog? I mean, that would be, and maybe call your dog back. No.
I'm waiting for the drone that will walk my dog, but that's okay. So you mentioned integrations and partnerships, and I think it's a good time to talk about this. You also work with startups and charities to bring mapping and GIS data to really interesting use cases. And if someone has this great idea that requires mapping services, how do they go about working with y'all?
Yeah, our startup in kind of emerging business programs are probably some of the most exciting partnerships that we have because we're dealing with partners that are in that startup mode. They have a piece of technology that's very compelling and leading edge. And what we do with them is bring them in and we empower them with software and help to get their technology integrated with the software. But also sometimes we talk about their business models and their business. We help them build business cases for positioning their technology to our user bases. And we do this very generously with these customers. A lot of them do not have to pay for our software until they really are mature enough to do that. And the help we give them is in the form of like dedicated partner managers and lots of resources that are at their disposal to help them get through the early stages of their startup. Now, in the imagery space that I work in, we run into some super exciting partnerships, people who are building constellations of satellites that either do something very novel and unique, like GHGSat, that's really looking for greenhouse gas emissions and really trying to forward the accountability for those types of emissions. But also partnerships like companies like Albedo. Albedo is trying to build an extremely high resolution satellite constellation, one where the resolution of those pictures would be considered shocking to some people, but would also be considered extremely valuable at identifying like a company's assets from space or really building out 3D models that are very accurate from space over areas that you traditionally couldn't acquire because satellites can fly over areas where you can't fly an aircraft or a drone. It's a really exciting partnership program.
All right. Well, Bo, thanks for coming on the show this week. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Stacy. I had a great time.
And that concludes this week's episode of the Internet of Things podcast. Please join us next Thursday and don't forget to subscribe. And if you can't get enough IoT news, I would love for you to sign up at www.stacyoniot.com for our weekly IoT newsletter, where we explain all kinds of things that we don't even get to on the show. Once again, thank you for listening and please subscribe.